What follows is a brief construction montage.
Late again.
Limited time only.
Flashback. End of flashback. Soon after montage.
Yesterday.
Meanwhile,
back in the lowland. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab.
a few moments later.
Moments later.
Moments later.
Moments later. More moments later.
Later still. Later.
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 Later. Later.
Later. Later.
Later. In the void. A little later.
Later that same evening.
Later that night. Later that night.
Later that day.
Much
Later.
Much later.
Much later.
Much later.
Not much later.
The following Thursday.
You get the idea.
Just then.
Just
By sheer coincidence.
12 o'clock midnight. 3:28 a.m.
7:59 a.m.
8:01 p.m.
10 seconds later.
12 seconds later.
1 minute later.
1 minute 37 seconds later.
2 very boring minutes later.
5 minutes later.
5 minutes later.
5 minutes later.
11 minutes later. 15 minutes later.
20 minutes later.
Many minutes later.
A few minutes later.
A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later.
1 hour 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 later. 1 hour later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later.
2 hours later.
2 hours later.
2 hours later.
2 hours later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later.
3 hours later.
3 hours later.
3 hours later.
3 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
5 hours later.
346 minutes later. 6 hours later. 6 hours later. 6.5 hours later.
7 hours later.
8 hours later.
8
hours later.
9 hours later. Approximately 10 hours later.
Several song-filled hours later.
Many hours later.
Many unbearable hours later.
Many chilly hours later.
Many hours of fun time later. Tomorrow for sure.
24 hours later.
24 hours later.
The next morning.
The next morning. The next Christmas. The next morning.
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 Early the next morning. The next day.
The next day.
The next day. The next day. The next day.
The next day.
The next day in a parallel universe.
The following day.
Tomorrow.
The next evening.
The very next evening.
Day 2. 48 hours later.
2 days later.
Day 3.
72 hours later.
3 days later.
3 days later.
3 days later.
3 days later. Day 4.
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. Several days later.
Several days later.
Several long days later.
1 week later.
1 week later.
1 weekend of pampering later.
2 weeks later.
16 paranoia-filled days later.
3 weeks later.
3 weeks later.
4 to 6 weeks later.
6 months later.
6 months later.
6 months later.
7 months later.
Several months later.
Many months later.
70 years later.
75 years later.
2,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
1 million zillion jillion dillion cotillion times later.
1 eternity later.
5 billion years later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Opening night. A lot of boring math later.
Many tic-tacs later. Many secret parties later.
1 semester later.
1 season later.
8 semesters later.
1 debt to society later.
1 very long digestive tract later.
1 little boost to the surface later. 1 operation later.
1 pathetic sob story later. 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 long angry line later.
1 shift later.
1 shift later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 1 wiener later.
1 nap later.
1 pair of pants later.
2 idiots later.
82 kilometers later.
298 frozen patties later. Thousands of tears later.
3,000 whoop-whoos later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
A few inches later. Eventually, several bad puns later.
Many, many toys later. Graduation day.
Epilogue.
Epilogue.
We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.